Okay, recording.
Excellent.
Well
Hi,
done, Yuri.
everybody. Um, I'm Ted. I seem to be emceeing these things lately, so I can keep doing that today. Hope everyone's doing well. Is anyone calling in from the Trace Context workshop, by the way?
I think that ended yesterday.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
Not to mention it's like middle of the night in Australia.
Yeah, that was going to apologize to anyone who was trying to attend both, basically. Yeah. Let's see. So we have an agenda, and some of these first couple things relate, in my opinion. So I'm just going to go down the list. I'm a little underslept, so if I'm a little slow or I've missed something, just like jump in and say hey. But starting with, there's a couple of issues that were opened by Felix Barney around exposing things on span context. One is root, whether or not the span is the root span and should sampling decisions be made. The other was is sampled, and whether or not a span is currently being sampled, and exposing these on span context. I don't know. I don't think Felix is on the call, but I have some thoughts about exposing thing on span context, and that may be lining up with trace context. So I would be interested in hearing people's opinions about what they want exposed on the span context, and also whether they think that work should be kind of dovetailing with the trace context work going on. So I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that. No? Who added this to the agenda, by the way?
It's not I, although I mean I have opinions about it, but I didn't add it to the agenda.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear your opinions.
Yeah, I mean I don't know. It's something that we've discussed this in various forms in the past. I've always been really hesitant about adding getters that like have to, subtly have to do with implementation details of various systems. And I think an is sampled bit might actually pass the test of being like universally accepted as an idea enough that it's worth putting in there. But even that can be like more complicated than it seems. Like there are a number of systems that exist already that have varying degrees of sampledness. Like there's sort of sampled, and then there's sampled with even extra information, and it can be almost like a verbosity flag. So all of a sudden you have this like this concept that's in my mind going beyond the scope of describing instrumentation and going into the scope of depending on implementations that it's just like it's something I've always wanted to be really cautious about. But I mean I have looked at the issue and I understand why it's especially from there's a lot of optimizations you can make if you know you're not in a sampled path, and that's valuable. So I think I get it. I just I would just maybe want to be thoughtful about how it might evolve and try to avoid like just an obvious deprecation in 6 months or something like that as we make it a little more flexible. That's my only like really significant concern about it. But I'm curious what other people think.
Yeah.
I have a similar concern with the sample bit, definitely, because we're doing various experiments with sampling, which is not necessarily expressed as true and false. So that's kind of tricky to do. And then I don't have too big objections to his root. That seems like a reasonable thing, but it's like I think it's tightly coupled to the reason why Felix needs it is coupled to the sampled thing. So I'm not sure how critical that is really.
Mm.
He also had another PR today about like unwrapping spans as part of the Java API, but it's slightly different. But
Yeah. I find it related to this trace context workshop that just happened. So I would be curious, maybe to dovetail into that and back again to this, because I see the people trying to standardize and in the context of like, what is this wire protocol and what needs to be on there and what can we agree on there? That seems to be pretty similar to the kind of things we're sort of having to hash out with span context. And I would, kind of in a way make the argument that they are the same thing. Open tracing is the sort of language level API for trace context potentially. And I think it would be great if those two things had alignment with each other. But I just feel like people who have been having that trace context debate have probably been in the weeds a lot more about what people could realistically support or not. So maybe can someone who's been there report back on what they think about trace context and how that's going?
I missed second half of the discussion on the first day. So Tyler, have you been through all of that?
Yeah, so I tried to attend most of it. There were some parts that I wasn't able to attend, but the gist of it is they were able to basically come to as close of a consensus as you could really say they came to a consensus around, I believe. It was a very difficult discussion to follow, but basically I think they have a trace context header defined, and they were hashing out the details on the what was the other context? So trace context header is basically a fixed length with specific fields defined in it, and then there's the other. I can't remember if it was like application context or dang it.
It's a correlation context.
Yeah, that's the word. Thank you. Correlation context that allows for arbitrary elements that will be propagated along with the trace context header.
So baggage, basically?
So not the same as baggage. They wanted to make sure that there were some important distinctions. A couple that I recall are they want to define like a very minimal content length for the header. So basically, if it's over a certain limit, then it's deemed as invalid and can be discarded. But also, they wanted to say that I think the other distinction that they made was baggage is deemed as best effort pass along, but not always essential. Whereas this correlation context, I think they wanted to have the semantics be pass along by default and make a best effort to pass that along. I was participating remotely, and so in a lot of regards, it was very difficult to follow along. I think they did a good job of taking notes, and so I encourage you to review the notes from the workshop.
Oh, sweet.
So Tyler, I have one question about the first part. I mean, the baggage thing, okay, whatever, but you said fixed length for the non-baggage part. So what do you mean by fixed length? Do you mean like the trace IDs and the span IDs, they decided that there was a certain length that was...
I don't think they got into that level of detail. What I think that I meant by that is they have a fixed number of fields defined. I don't think
got it. Yeah.
really specified the exact details on those individual fields.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's actually like a wise way to do it. I'm glad to hear that, because it seemed like there on GitHub the discussion was converging on, you know, like, yeah, you can have, like, we don't need to have everyone agree about the length of particular fields themselves. And then I was surprised to hear that going back. But it sounds like what you mean is that there is a fixed set of fields and an assumption that they're like, quote unquote, reasonable length. Like this, you're not going to have the kind of baggage issue with things getting user-defined data and stuff like that. Got it.
Yeah, so I think that actually defining those fields is, I think, still to be determined. I think they want to nail that down a little bit further, but yeah, I don't expect it to be arbitrary.
I'll read the notes, but go ahead.
So one thing about the, I guess, tracing fields, that the length wasn't actually discussed that much, but what was discussed a lot is the notion whether everyone can treat the trace ID as opaque blob, because some tracing systems, like in Amazon, they actually encode timestamp in it, and they like do some business logic based on that. So for them, trace ID is not opaque, and I think some other systems do, like what is Microsoft? They're using this hierarchical, but they append it to the trace ID rather than to the request ID. I think they were, so I think there's a lot of discussions about whether all those systems can cope with the opaque trace ID, and I did not see the final conclusion in the notes. I got the feeling that they did agree that like it's like not free, but most systems can cope with some work to actually treat trace ID as opaque, because I think that was one of the biggest open questions, really.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure what they decided for how Amazon was going to handle it, but I'm pretty sure that that Microsoft was encouraged to move that hierarchical portion to the correlation context map.
Yeah, and yeah, and another thing about what was interesting about trace ID is that Dynatrace doesn't even have a concept of trace ID. They simply link by the individual span request IDs. And apparently HBase did something similar in the past, but not now.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the thing that I wanted to ask is sort of getting into it, and I don't think it would be in the notes, was more like, you know, we can try really we can try as hard as we want to like agree on how we're formatting things, but a lot of these IDs end up being like almost inextricably linked to the way that the tracing systems actually behave and create new spans and so on and so forth. And I wasn't sure, when I thought about this, I wasn't sure how to actually arrive at like semantic alignment without having the specification like literally encode things like how spans are related to each other and how IDs are chosen. Maybe that's considered a non-goal, but I was wondering if the discussion was able to kind of like steer clear of that to a certain extent. It just seems like very fraught to me, and it's the reason why I've always kind of given up on that project, to be honest. Like, I just don't know how to do it. But like, I was curious just almost more for the Dynatrace people, like, is this something that's beneficial for them if, you know, they get handed IDs that they can't work with? Like why do they care or something like that? I don't know. I don't know how else to express that question. I don't mean to be snarky about it, but it's just, I was curious, like, what are they aiming to get out of a standard that they can't use in their system? I guess is what I was getting at.
Yeah, I think that goes into the second part, which was pretty large discussion about the actual interop modes, which to me is sort of the most vague area of this whole initiative, is like what exactly they're trying to achieve. And so there are some proposals about like compatibility levels, like level 0, you simply pass what you were given and you don't modify, whereas in level 1, you actually replace some portions of the trace context. But I was not part of that, so I only saw that from the notes. Yeah,
I mean, the level 0 thing makes a ton of sense to me, but that discussion is easy. It's like you decide on a header name, you put some constraints on the length of it, and you're done. It's not like you don't need to discuss anything that's complicated. But it's the additional levels of it where I actually like it would be awesome. Whenever I've had those conversations, even with two parties, I've been unable to find a path that actually really works. Like because of things like the Amazon timestamps and the Dynatrace lack of Trace ID, and HBase has kind of a funny model as well. It's just like I just don't know how to resolve those things without forcing the systems themselves to actually fundamentally change their data models.
I mean, some of those I don't think are as big of a problem. I mean, for example, I believe that Dynatrace can just ignore the trace ID as long as it's got the two span correlations. They should be fine. But in terms of how to define the trace ID, and I think defining the span IDs is less of a concern because a lot of times those can be considered more trace system dependent. But defining the trace ID, I do see as a potential important point to discuss.
Yeah, and I will say that's been probably one of the longest debated things to add to span context is, correlation ID, which ends up to me just being a proxy for trace ID and span ID or something like that. So I think it's something we should figure out. I and many other people, I think, want to build tooling on top of the open tracing API that helps correlate what you're doing with your tracer and what you might be doing with other systems like metrics and logging and things like that. And it definitely feels like there isn't enough of that kind of correlative information being exposed currently by span context.
I almost wonder if it would be worth holding off on adding these additional APIs till we see where things end up with trace context, and perhaps build more off of that project and see if by integrating trace context into open tracing, does that solve the problem in a better way? Yeah,
I wholly agree with that. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine a world where everyone could agree that this wire protocol is like standard enough. We're all going to adopt it and be satisfied, but we wouldn't want to expose those things on the in-process span context. They seem pretty similar. Same discussions would come up in both cases. So it would be great if they dovetailed, and if trace context is close to getting over the line, I would also want to make sure we kind of adopt the same language that they're using, so there's not a weird impedance mismatch there.
I certainly think it's far enough along that we don't want to go and do our own thing.
One thing, though, is that I think Edwin made a very kind of pragmatic proposal, is that he said, okay, well, if we cannot satisfy everyone, the options are either we just drop this initiative altogether, or we say we're going to cover 80% and then 20 can think what they want to do, maybe like change their systems to actually be compatible with that one. So this might be like an approach to open tracing as well, because like we're saying that we want to support every possible like tracing system today with the API, but then in practice maybe there aren't any tracing systems who do not have trace ID, which are open tracing compatible today, right? So we may want to weigh pros and cons of actually like not providing functionality because of some theoretical possibility that someone may have another tracing system.
Yeah. I predict no matter what we pick, it has to include, not applicable for each one of these getters, right? Like if you ask for trace ID and you get a blank string back, that doesn't mean the trace ID is blank string. It means there is no trace ID or it's not supported. Likewise, sampling bit can be a sampling, enum that is like sampled, not sampled, and not applicable. I think there's ways we can we can kind of expose it in a optional manner. But yeah, we should wait at least a bit until trace context either hashes out. I think some of these things, they're actively hashing it out. If they like start to stall or seem like they can't get enough consensus there, I suspect the open tracing span context requirements might be a little more relaxed than their requirements. Like, I don't think we necessarily need to think about things like the length of the span ID and stuff like that to expose these APIs. But there should be some back and forth there.
So one of the interesting things that I heard from the meeting is that's relevant to this current discussion is this notion of delegating the decision of the sampling decision to a child call. So this only works when there's like a request and response, but a parent could say, hey, I don't have a strong opinion on whether I want to sample or not, or I don't want to take that responsibility. It lets the child call basically make that decision by like denoting a question mark, for example, I think, and then waiting for a response header to come back before knowing whether they need to sample or not. And I think this was talked about by the gentleman from Amazon as something that they do, because they, as an infrastructure provider, they don't necessarily have strong opinions on whether to sample, and they don't want to be in charge of determining that sampling ratio. So I thought that was interesting, and I think that kind of bolsters this decision of it would be hard to really definitively say whether is sampled should be true or false.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes what I've noticed that people think about sampling in one of two ways. Like, one is this kind of thing that you're talking about with the extra folks, where it's like, well, you want to control if it's sampled. The other one is really about performance, and it's like, sometimes there are things that you do on the sampled path that are expensive, and so you want to make sure you don't do them unless you have to, and that's like strictly a verbosity optimization kind of thing, and they actually like kind of have different implications to the API just in the way that you're talking about. I'm not proposing what the solution is, but it's an interesting problem. I think people often say, oh, I want a sample bit. What they actually want is control over how much time they're spending, CPU time they're spending on the sample path, which is sort of like a different thing, you know?
Yep. Okay. So I'd like to suggest we've got some other big items on the agenda, and just one last round if anyone has any last comments on span context and trace context. Otherwise, we'll move on to Java. Cool. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. So the next big item here is the Java API release candidate, scopes versus continuations. I personally have been doing a lot of outreach on this with a number of other people who have been really great, putting in a lot of effort and thought into this issue, because we really want to make sure we get this right or close to right. I'm personally feeling pretty satisfied at this point that we could get by without continuations, and that seems to make people happy. I also think it's conceivable that we could add continuations or continuation-like construct to a scope in the scope manager proposal like we currently have at a later date if it turns out we really, really needed it, but I'm currently not seeing a need for it. Those two things to me say that we should start moving towards shipping with what we have. So I have sort of two questions for the group. One, people who are interested in Java and have been following this, do you also feel satisfied and feel like we could move forwards? And the next question is, of course, next steps. What should we do in preparation for that? So let's start with the first question of if we could just go around and people say either like yay or nay on scopes and the scope proposal. So, and to make this easier, I'm just going to go across this this line that I see at the top of my screen. So starting with Yuri, what do you think, man?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I haven't been following the experiments people did with Akka and other things, but I did see them mentioning that they were okay without continuations. And I think this was the biggest sort of proving point that if that's satisfactory, then I'm good to go with that one, with just the scope.
Yeah. Some of us had a really good long discussion with some people from Lightbend, whose name Victor, I believe his name was. Might be mispronouncing that. That was really insightful, and I think they're going to be showing up more. But they agreed they had something like continuations, but kind of dropped it. So that was a sign that maybe you don't need this for Akka, since they made
it. Would be good if they had like maybe in this doc or somewhere in the GitHub some like brief description of how they were able to get away without using continuations as a pattern, and so then we can say, okay, well, this solves the continuation problem.
Yeah, I mean the pattern really turns out to be if you need some kind of special mechanism for tracking the span, you're doing that at the instrumentation level rather than at the tracer level. So most things don't need this, right? And the occasions where you do need some kind of reference counting thing or something fancy, turns out almost always a place to put that. It means you have to use a instrumented actor or an instrumented future or something of that nature potentially. But that does in fact work, and we now have implementations of that proving that it works with OT. I don't think Carlos is on the call, but he's been doing a lot of good work on that front.
Okay.
And are we fairly confident that this will also work for the MDC style pattern of swapping out the logging context?
I don't think it will. In the respect that we're not providing any kind of mechanism with this current API to put that in there. But I have a lot of faith that MDC would work as an observer. And so there's this sort of actually dovetails with the trace context, span context discussion earlier, which is observers, I think, suffer a bit of extra complexity because we don't expose a correlation ID and some things that would make observers work better. But I think if you did that, and in fact there is Mabin, and I'm not sure what his real name is. I just call him Mabin in my head because that's what his GitHub handle is.
Marcel.
Marcel. Marcel. I apologize for thinking of you as Mabin. But he has an issue, which I will paste into the notes, about exactly this. And he also has a conclusion, I believe, that if you had some kind of correlation ID, you can make this work as an observer. He's made it work as a wrapper, but wrappers are kind of problematic. So that's my pitch on MDC, that's a sort of optional thing that can go on top of that. That's the kind of thing that should work with observers, and that's the kind of integration thing we need to be doing in general. So it's not an MDC specific thing. It's a correlating tracing with whatever you're trying to do.
Right. And the part that I wasn't sure about is will the lack of a continuation, basically something that says, hey, I'm leaving this thread kind of thing, and is that going to be detrimental to MDC? And it sounds like not. It sounds like just following the scope lifecycle is probably enough. Is that the consensus there?
Yeah, I'm not an MDC expert, but the people who care about it seem to be hopeful that it works at that.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, and I'll post that into the meeting notes afterwards. I'm not going to try to find it right now. Okay, and since we're on you, Tyler, so what do you think about this Java API? I mean, I know you've been working on it extensively with me, so it's kind of a leading question, but I would say like, your thoughts.
Yeah, so I've kind of gone back and forth a lot. I think that it sounds promising. Since we're on this kick of let's simplify the API, it kind of got me wondering, is there other aspects of the open tracing API that should be considered as like perhaps too complicated and that maybe we could reduce? So, I mean, one example might be with the advent of open tracing, or sorry, not open, with the trace continue, sorry, the distributed tracing workshop, for example, and this trace context discussion. If we have this correlation context, do we really need to have baggage? Or maybe baggage or something like that should be extracted out. Anyway, so that's one thing that I've been thinking about. Is there other aspects of this that we could simplify? But in terms of the proposed changes with scope and removing continuations, I've come around and I think that it's okay. I don't have problems with it.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's possible some other things might be simplified. I think baggage is here to stay, personally. I want something like that. In fact, there's been calls for even more things like it, but we'll see. Personally, I have no appetite for trying to go any farther than we have with this round, given that we're trying to get this continuation stuff done. It's been such a long, hard road to really vet this thing. But certainly, I think there's a window here for people to investigate other nits. I would just be sensitive to the fact that we don't want to perturb people's existing instrumentation if we can avoid it. But if other people have thoughts about simplifying the API, please speak up.
I do think it's a good point, Tyler, and I think there are a couple of opportunities to do that. I had a conversation with Bogdan Drutu, who's works at Google and works on census and open census, and like TLDR, like yes, I think there's some things that could be done to the API that might be considered improvements if you ignore backwards compatibility. And since we're doing something that's not very backwards compatible, maybe this is a good opportunity. I would suggest that, like, maybe to reframe Ted's question, I think we should not be like, is everything about the open tracing API perfect right now, and make it more like, in terms of the scopes change, like how do we feel about it? And on that front, I mean, otherwise it's like the scope of the question is too large, but no pun intended. But for the scopes piece itself, just like, since I'm talking and I'm about to mute myself, I'm totally fine with it, and I think I would like really applaud Ted and Tyler and well, really a lot of people, honestly, who spent a great deal of time trying to figure out whether this would not work in some important corner case. And I feel like, given the amount of work that's been done to vet it, that I have no question that it's sufficient. And yeah, I'm like 3 thumbs up on the scopes piece itself.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Okay. Just moving down the list, JP. Also, I realized we didn't do a round of introductions. So, hi, JP. If you want to introduce yourself, please go ahead as part of this.
Yeah, so I'm Zhuka, and I work at Red Hat with Gary and Pavel. I think we met at KubeCon earlier this year.
Yes, yeah, I remember you there actually.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I contributed a couple open tracing Java instrumentation libraries. Yeah.
Yeah, and so have you been following this Scopes API change, and or do you feel like you don't have any blocking concerns at this moment?
No, not really. I don't have any blocking issues.
Awesome. Okay. I think we'll go into like what we should do with next steps after this round. I just want everyone to have a chance to weigh in if they want. Jonathan, I think you're next up on my list here.
Yeah, hi, Jonathan, Facebook. I didn't have much context, so I was reading through the discussion on the continuations versus ref counting. Like, given that we're not currently using the instrumentation, I don't think we have a dog in the fight. We've generally had issues with ref counting and application code, so I think anything that makes it explicit is usually easier to deal with. But yeah.
Yeah, that's very good feedback. Thank you. E. Dison Gao, and I am really butchering your handle. I'm just going to call you Ed.
Ed's fine. I usually go by Edison. I also work at Facebook, and like John, I'm pretty interested in the continuations and ref counting stuff, but I think we're in completely separate spheres.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that make it interesting, which is why we're very attracted to it. But then it came down to a question of like, well, did tracing itself need this, or was it just like something that was interesting that opened up other possibilities at the expense of making the API more complicated and making some people who didn't want ref counting upset? So that's why we're pulling it out. And then we have...
There's also, yeah, the Joe is Addison at Facebook.
Sweet. And then I see Jose Carlos. I'm sure you're happy this is getting pulled in so that we can start pushing PHP out the door, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so as I said before, what we are waiting for is for the in-process context propagation to get merged in Python. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I talked with the author of the pull request in Python, and he told me that this thing is going to get merged soon. So once we have that, we are ready to merge, because basically our pull request is way more simpler than the problems we're having with Java, and it's almost a one-to-one mapping with the Python one. So, but honestly, I think we could even give a try before that, because I saw that there are people already working on, for instance, the Jagger client for PHP, which uses the specification, the PHP library, and I'm working on a bridge between Zipkin and Open Tracing. So I tried the API many times, and it proves to work. We have got some feedback, and yeah, I think we are quite ready to go.
Yeah, I would second that personally. I've looked at the work you're doing, the work Manu's doing in Python, and they look very similar. I don't think there's any radical changes that are going to occur, or places where the naming conventions are going to get strayed too far from each other. So personally, I'm fine with pulling it in. And I know, yeah, sounds like you're feeling some pressure, people are adopting it. So
Yeah, that's the thing that worries me more, because people is adapting it, and I don't know if like there is already a use case for production systems. In terms of instrumenting common frameworks without the in-process context propagation is not possible, but I don't know if that is a use case for people already. I don't know like how they are using it, but like I saw that there are people using the library, and that's maybe something that we should prioritize.
Great. Well, we can bring this up in the PHP Gitter channel, but I think we should merge it in. Especially, it's a young API too, so I think if we need to make some adjustments, I imagine people will be okay with that. But I don't see why, especially if you're already finding it to be successful.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't know if anyone else on the call is interested in working on PHP and has thoughts on that, since it's brought up. So we take some space right here. If other people have questions or comments on the PHP, it's a good chance.
I have one question really quick. Does the PHP API at the open tracing layer have some kind of flush mechanism built in? Because one of the challenges of PHP, at least in its like normal kind of like Apache-ish mode, it's like, you know, you have to flush the tracer on every request, and in the past it's been a sort of an interesting design question as to whether or not that flush is part of the open tracing API or just part of the tracer API implementation, which like creates a tight coupling. I was just curious, like, did that end up, because PHP is so frequently used in that pattern, did it end up being part of the actual open tracing API?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I've been discussing this like 2 weeks ago with Datadog people, because they also wanna push their PHP client for Datadog using open tracing, and they had the same concern about one request, one flash, and I opened a issue in my Zipkin library for discussing this stuff. It's called bulk reporting, that I will share with you guys in the chat. And basically, Ben Everley came up with his own experience, because he's maintaining a vendor called Tidaways. And he explains the way they do, and how most of the PHP APM does, which is that they drop the traces in through the TCP IP protocol, and then there is something collecting the spans. But basically, you do a light flush on every request, because you cannot. There's no way you can keep a state in PHP, but like this is a like low overhead flash, and then all the work is done by a collector in background. And another option we explored was to basically drop all the spans into a file, and then having again a collector or a worker like getting the spans from the file and drop into the collector. Problem with that is that we have some other complexity, which is what if I do a deploy, what if it's containerized, what if like some other stuff. So this issue that I share has most of the information from Ben, and that's the approach we will have from Zipkin. From open tracing perspective, I don't think this is something that should be part of the library. But of course, this kind of discussions are very healthy, and maybe we should point out this workflow somewhere.
I think it's probably best to be cautious in it, which is to say, like, you could leave it out of the main API, but putting something in the README about, you know, just like calling out that this is a really idiomatically common thing, and like how to deal with it in practice, it seems like a nice compromise for the short term. But I'm flexible. I was just curious. It was something that with PHP has always been kind of a challenge.
Yeah, so yeah, that's true. I opened another issue, but it's in the open tracing spec, which was aiming to discuss something similar, but since we might take some other approach, because the current approach was, and it's the approach that has also light step, which is that every request, once you deliver the headers and the body of the response, you do the flash in the after shutdown hook. Yeah, I was in the issue. I was trying to discuss if we should include something about this in the tracing itself, in the tracer, sorry, in the tracer class. And yeah, maybe we will like take this discussion after we solve the actual implementation, so we can present some use cases.
Awesome. That sounds like a great path forward.
Yeah, like I mean, I am really eager to implement what Benjamin suggested and see how it performs in Zipkin, and then we replicate that in every other vendor.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited. Okay, anyone else? Any other PHP related stuff? Okay, great. Yeah, looking forward to seeing that get merged in. And again, we'll bring it up in the Gitter channel. Back to going down the line, comments on Java. I've got Sergey is next on my list here. Hi, Sergey.
Hey, yeah. Actually, I'm happy with Scope API and I don't like continuation. It just creates for me a lot of problems. It's hard to debug not in the simple case, but when you have some complicated case and hard to find where your span is finished, where not. Yeah, Scope API much more clear and easy, and actually all tracing libraries I can replace with Scope API without continuation. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. I'm glad to hear it. Okay. And this thing keeps moving people around on me. So if I miss you, I apologize. But I've got Gary Brown next on my list here.
Yeah, I'm happy with the change. We've done the change in the Jaeger client and quite a lot of the instrumentations in a contrib repository. So yeah, happy.
Awesome.
I mean, the only thing is, I guess the issue about the finish on close and stuff like that's going to be dealt with as a cleanup here.
Yeah, you mean whether or not you finish the span when you close the scope or not?
Yeah, just whether it's the default or whether we're going to be, explicit about how it's done.
Yeah, I felt like the feedback we were getting, it seemed just cleaner and made more sense to have it the default be it doesn't do that. We made it initially the default that it did because it seemed convenient, and then we're getting feedback that was confusing. But that's definitely a good point to bike shed over. I don't know if you have an opinion on that, Gary.
No, I don't mind either way, or just make it explicit. But
yeah, it just false seems like a better explicit. Personally, I'm always weirded out when you have a Boolean value and the true is the default. But whatever, that's just me. Pavel, any thoughts from you?
Hi, I'm fine with the new API. My biggest concern is with auto finishing on the close, like the default. And I think it's much cleaner to like don't do that or have it explicitly specified always.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, because it feels weird when you call tracer and activate, and it will be auto finished. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
But the new API works fine.
Awesome. Okay, I think that's everyone. This list turns out to not be stable, so I apologize if I missed someone, so please speak up if I did. But I'd like to move on to sort of discussing next steps, since we seem to be in agreement that this should go in. In particular, I think we shouldn't just pull the trigger and merge it. I think, personally, I think we should give people a chance through some outreach to let them know that it's coming. And I also wonder about whether or not there's any backwards compatibility or other work we want to do, such as getting instrumentations ported over or something of that nature before pulling the trigger, versus
significant amount of documentation work that needs to be done as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. So I'm gonna start making a list. Proposed next steps. I'm not very good at typing and talking at the same time, but doc cleanup definitely seems good. I'd hate to open up the bike shed of like, did we name everything correctly? But I guess there's one last chance to have a knit around some of these names. My only concern there would be names if somehow something's just not perfectly symmetrical. Like we have like activate and close versus activate and deactivate, for example, things like that. But I really don't want to bike shed about names. But if something does seem like it's confusing the language when we write docs, that would seem important. Any other proposals people have, things they would like to see, they're concerned about and would definitely like to see done before we pull the trigger on this?
I would just like to see like if those async frameworks could describe the pattern that they use, like maybe some very contrived examples.
Yeah, I think Tyler, you've made these, right?
Yeah, I have a PR open with all of the examples I wrote updated for the new RC.
Sweet.
And that includes a very limited examples for an actor style pattern, a promise style pattern, and a suspend resume style pattern.
Nice.
Yeah, and also there's with I know Carlos is working on some Akka instrumentation that should actually like actual libraries that you should be able to use. So hopefully there'll actually be things for people in Scala open tracing soon. All right. There's certainly a question about backwards compatibility or like bridges for adoption, because the current API has been out there for a while. A number of tracers have bound to it. A lot of people have instrumented with it. I'm curious what people think we should do. What's like critical as far as providing some support to take the pain away there. This is where my personal lack of Java expertise really shows its head. I know there's got to be some tricky things around now having like two flavors of the same API that are in the same namespace potentially, and wanting to make shims and things, and how that gets a little complicated. But I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that.
So one thing I would like to suggest is that before we actually do the release, we need to make sure that all of the public contribution projects at least have an RC based update for those packages.
Yeah. And I would say like the sort of inverse of that as well, like we want to probably retain a flavor of these things for the existing API, right? Like on a branch. And a question actually came up there during this process around what the naming convention should be if you're trying to tag a version of your library to be with this API versus another one. It's a bit odd. I mean, people usually would just have versions of their library, but especially with like a release candidate, how do you deal with the fact that the library has a version and the API it's binding to has a version? And could we have like a convention for that? So it's a little clear what these things are when you look at somebody's branches and tags. Possibly it's just a non-issue, but
I guess my question that's related to that is, how long do we expect or intend or hope people support the previous version for?
Yeah. Well, certainly it's going to take people who have instrumented their applications potentially a while to port over. But an alternative is it actually easier to provide shims for tracers? And would that make life easier for people? I guess it would make life easier for application developers. They're going to be stuck on 30 for a bit and then want to move over.
I mean, it seems to me that if we had a shim that at least syntactically supported the 30 API and would take a 31 tracer as a parameter, I'm not totally positive of this. I think that could be done without a great deal of difficulty. Then application owners would have a way to like bridge instrumentation, and tracer owners wouldn't really need to care that much about this. Like they would need to support 31, and then the shim could be an answer in the worst case to support 30 for a long time. I think the biggest sort of annoyance in my mind is that they both live in the same Java package, and having having the shim be an IO open tracing as well as the non-shim could be sort of problematic. I think it would probably require like an io.opentracing.shim or something package that and like a change to code that would like involve modifications to import paths or something. I mean, it seems like that's the kind of stuff that seems really nasty to me, frankly. Like if someone here who has a lot of experience doing shading and figuring out how to get all the POM stuff to fit together can like tell me this isn't a big deal, that would be a relief. But like if we can get that to work, then all these other problems kind of go away. I'd be curious to hear if someone with like deep knowledge of kind of Java jar madness like has an opinion about that.
From what I understand, having an application with certain classes on the class path. So for example, span with that they expect. And then a tracer unmodified coming in with the same span class that it expects, but of a different structure. I think it would be really difficult to create a shim that would be able to translate those effectively given Java's class path behavior.
Yes,
I don't.
And I also realized that we're out of time.
What?
I was just looking at the clock and realizing that we've actually exhausted our hour. Like Ted, how do you want to deal with the time problem?
Yes. If people need to drop off the call, that's understandable. I think we can continue this discussion on Gitter as far as what next steps are. I guess one final thing, maybe do we want to just give out a release date? Does anyone have an issue if we moved fast? That would be my final thing. Like if we said to people, we're going to release this a week from today, or 8 or 9 days from now, would anyone feel like that was too soon and would want it out longer? Where do people want that release date to be?
Could we get a milestone created inside of GitHub and all of the PRs that we want to associate with that? Like make sure that it's tagged so that way we know when all of the PRs that are based off of 31 are open or closed.
Great. That's a great idea. Okay. We can do it
As
that
for the
way.
date,
Yeah, and
I think that we would want to have. Sorry, I think that we would want to have a period of time that it's stable and say everyone, this is kind of the official thing. This is going out in 2 weeks or something like that. After the last change.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know just how far out that I would like to announce that date soon, right? I want people to be like, this is your last chance to have a look at this. I just don't know how much time we should associate with that, if it's a week or 2 weeks. Personally, I think 2 weeks is sufficient. Whatever we're going to do, I think we'll be well on our way in 2 weeks. And if we haven't ported all of the instrumentation over by then, I think that's okay too. So I actually don't think that'll take very long. Okay. If anyone else has interest in this, let's continue the discussion on Gitter. And like Tyler suggested, let's create some tracking milestones. I'll update the GitHub issue that's been tracking this project with this information. But we should also think about who we want to reach out to and create a list of people we want to alert about this. Specifically, I'm thinking about tracing vendors who might have bound to this but aren't, involved enough that they come to these calls and maybe aren't watching Gitter. Instana, I'm looking at you wherever you are.
We're out of time. Do you want to defer the last item on the agenda to next time, or maybe move it to the mailing list?
Yeah.
I can just write an email about it. It's more of an FYI.
Yeah. It's just more of a call. Hey, could we get some more structure? But yeah, let's do it on the mailing list.
Manu also wanted me to mention that he's going to be submitting a PR to the Python stuff next week.
Yes.
That's great news.
Awesome. All right. Let's end on that high note.
Yeah.
Happy
All right.
Friday.
Yeah. Ciao, everyone.
Okay, bye. Thanks.
Bye.